For the entire decade of the 1990s, this was the most powerful group in Mexico. Like, these are the kind of things you see in the movies.
Yeah.
This is actually that. You fight for control of the ports. You fight for control of the border crossings. Other key assets are key corrupted political officials. You know, the thing about Mexico is power doesn't come from weapons or product. Power comes from...
Let's do it.
Let's switch sides.
No, what are you talking about? Let's do it. Go.
Okay, well, do your intro.
I don't have an intro. The intro is we just start talking. Because remember, the lower third is going to slide out. And it says, you know, Pierre Rausini, former LA Kingpin. And then it'll go, shh. But see, we don't even have an intro. I don't think Rogan does it. Somebody suggested, I know what it was. Julian, my buddy Julian suggested, he said, we don't do intros anymore, Matt. He said, we're not doing intros anymore. He said, Danny and I talked about it. We're not wasting time on intros. We just go right into it. I said, okay, Julian, that's what we're doing. So that's what I started doing. Saves a few seconds, except for this nonsense right here that we're
Okay.
Go ahead.
So you're not going to say anything at all on this running?
No, we're starting with the... So we are starting... All right, so we're going to be discussing the creation of the Mexican cartels and their how they've evolved over the years, why they've evolved, and the controversies within them, and the wars, and the whole thing. We're going all into it.
Yeah, we'll be discussing the genesis of the cartels and how they developed.
It's perfect. Yes, let's do it.
Right.
I'm excited.
All right, well, 50 years ago, there were two cartels operating in Mexico.
Right.
There was the Guadalajara cartel, which controlled the bulk of the border region, and then there was the Gulf cartel. During the mid-'80s, an arrangement was made between the Colombians and the Mexicans in order to use Mexico as a transshipment point.
Right.
In fact, we discussed this during an earlier podcast.
Right.
Okay. Well, that relationship lasted for a few years before the Mexicans got smart and said, hey, we want to be paid in product for our services. This in turn prompted the Mexicans now to be able to begin developing their own distribution operations within the American market.
Right.
And so for the first time, what you had were Mexican kingpins with their own American-based distribution networks. And so this allowed for the Guadalajara cartel to begin increasing revenue because it's much more profitable, one, to not only smuggle the product on behalf of the Colombians, but the value of the product increases exponentially once it hits the American market.
Right.
And so, for instance, the leader of the cartel, Feliz Gallardo, was an individual who amassed the first multiple billion-dollar wealth. And this was back in the 1980s. And he created a structure with an entire second tier of up-and-coming younger generation guys who later on went on to become famous. Men like Chapo Guzman, Palma, Nacho Coronell, all these individuals ultimately went on to become initially his second tier and later on the leadership of the subsequent organizations. Now, what happened was in the mid-'80s, there was a tremendous amount of law enforcement scrutiny, particularly coming from the Drug Enforcement Administration. So there was a meeting held in Acapulco in 1987 where Feliz Gallardo essentially delegated authority for different regional outposts to 5 different groups. Mm-hmm. Later on, these are the 5 different groups that ultimately went on to become separate cartels. But initially, they were just responsible. They were like the local franchises.
Right.
And so he kept for himself and his family the crown jewel, which is the city of Tijuana. The Tijuana-San Diego corridor right there is very convenient for introducing contraband into the United States. 30 miles outside of Tijuana, you had the port of entry called Tecate. That was Chapo Guzman's. Then in Mexicali, went back to the Arianos, Felix's family. And then from there over, you had a group from Sonora, which is Caro Quintero's organization. Then you had the group in Juarez, which was Amaro Carrillo's organization. And so essentially from Tijuana to El Paso, you had 5 different groups that were responsible for handling the importation of material into the United States. Now, the most competent of those 5 groups was the one led by Chapo Guzman. Now, the difference between Guzman and the other individuals was the other people had direct family members involved.
Nepotism.
It's just straight up nepotism. Whereas with Guzman, he was competent. See, in that world, unlike the corporate world or being some drone working at Amazon, it's if you drop the ball, you get killed.
I was going to say, I feel like competency is reliant on murder.
Well, that's the great filter
Right.
in that community. And so everybody understood that if you were working for Guzman and you lost a load, curtains.
Right.
And so it weeded out the incompetence. And so he had been able to develop a reputation, even amongst the Colombians, where they would drop off a load to Mexico, and before their plane got back to Colombia, he'd already have it in LA. And so nepotism is great, but you put the people in power or you entrust them with the authority to exercise so long as you know they're going to get the job done.
Right. So nepotism is great for loyalty, but it doesn't necessarily translate to competency.
Yes. Well, so when Feliz Gallardo said, well, we're going to give Tijuana to my nephews, but we're going to give the Colombians' product to Guzman, because they knew he was going to get that product across the border without suffering any losses, whereas the nephews could handle the weed.
Right.
And so that went on until about 87. 87, he delegates everything to these various little groups. Now, in 1989, Feliz Gallardo gets knocked off. And those 5 regional outposts devolved. There's a fragmentation where it ultimately breaks down into 5 separate syndicates, which became the modern structure of the 5 cartels.
Right. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You're saying Guzman was in charge of the Sinaloa cartel, but...
Well, at the time, there was no cartel. He was
okay.
based...
So we were okay, sorry. So we haven't gotten to Zambada yet.
Oh, no. Back in 87, Zambada had nothing to do with this.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Remember, when they divvied up the territories in 87,
Right.
It was the border crossings.
Okay.
Understand, Sinaloa is not a border state. That's why later on they were at such a disadvantage, because they're 1,000 miles from
Right.
the border. The other 4 groups are border adjacent.
Right. Okay. Keep going. Keep
And
going.
so-
I thought you had skipped something.
No,
I
yes. And so initially he gets entrusted with this port of entry.
Right.
So that means that all contraband coming through that particular port of entry goes through him.
Right.
He controls the toll. Not only does he push through the product that he's responsible for, but he also charges all of the other organizations to use his bridge.
Right.
It's called Piso. And so where later on he felt as if he kind of got shafted was he ended up with 2 of the smaller ports of entry. Like the nepotism kicked in
Right.
a couple of years after this meeting, because when Gallardo got knocked off, all of a sudden it was a mad rush. People were grabbing and holding on to what they had previously been assigned. Well, he'd been assigned 2 small ones. The nephew's got the crown jewel. Carrillo's got a beautiful one in Nuevo Laredo and El Paso. Like all the other guys got the plums. He got the scraps.
Right.
And so, a second disadvantage he had also was the fact that he was young. I mean, 33-year-old, 34-year-old man. And so when you're dealing with men in their 50s, it's difficult for a 55-year-old to treat a 33-year-old as an equal.
Right.
And so although he was competent, he suffered from several disadvantages. 1, his youth. 2, he also suffered from the fact that, like I said, Sinaloa was not a border state. Now, what was interesting is prior to Feliz Gallardo getting arrested and illustrating the earlier point, there was a trafficker named Hector Palma. Pero Palma was much older, 15, 20 years older than Guzman. And he was another individual who was an extraordinary smuggler. And Palma was responsible for handling a lot of the loads for Feliz Gallardo. And Palma would he'd partner up with Guzman to go through his port of entry. Competence finds competence.
Right.
Well, back in the late 80s, there was a load that ended up getting knocked off, multiple ton shipment, which for the late 80s, 87, 88, those were big loads. It wasn't until later on that you started seeing the much larger loads. And when you suffer a loss like that, the organization is responsible for the loss. So now Felix Gallardo's got to pay the Colombians. Now he's not going to pay full price, but he may end up having to pay the Acapulco price, but it's still coming out of his pocket. So now he looks incompetent and it's costing him money. So Guido Palma and his business partner get called to account. The partner gets killed. Guido Palma gets spared. However, Palma now found himself excommunicated from the community.
Or they don't give him an opportunity to try and make it up?
No, he essentially got expelled.
Right. Because, I mean, a lot of times they don't just whack you. A lot of times they'll say, like, if you can, we're going to let you make it up. If you get hit again, then you're done.
Now, Felix Gallardo had turned into a monster by that point.
Oh, okay.
And so Palma gets spared, but he's essentially on the outs. And how when we're in prison, everything in prison breaks down usually along racial or ethnic lines, particularly at the higher security level institutions.
Right.
And if you find yourself excluded from your particular community,
now you're
now you're potentially victim of being preyed upon.
Right. You don't have anybody to back you up. You're a lone wolf.
Yeah. Yes. And so that's the circumstance that he found himself in. And unfortunately for Palma, his wife was manipulated into falling in love with another trafficker, some Venezuelan guy. He fills her head full of these pipe dreams. They're going to take off together. They're going to live together happily ever after. She withdraws like $8 to $10 million worth of Palma's money from the account, grabs the kids, and leaves with the Venezuelan. Well, it turns out the Venezuelan was put up for this mission by the Arianos and Felix Gallardo. So they get the wife and children down to Venezuela. They decapitate her and kill his children.
Ooh.
So now they send a box to Guido Palma.
Not good. That's a bad.
He opens up.
That's some bad. That's yeah, that's okay. Sorry.
Yeah, and so to hear this guy, his wife's gone, his children's gone, his money's gone. He's freaking the hell out. What the hell's going on? He gets a box.
All right.
Like UPS delivery. Opens it up. There's a severed head. There's a VHS tape. He grabs the VHS tape, pops it into VCR, and the children had been taken to a bridge in Venezuela.
Oh, I remember this.
And they tossed the kids off the bridge. And so, of course, they filmed the children plummeting to their deaths. Young children too, like 8-year-old, 9-year-olds.
Yeah.
And Palma, of course, absolutely loses his mind.
Right.
And so this is like 1988. The following year, early 89, Felix Gallardo gets knocked off. He's now sitting in custody. Well, Guido Palma goes and joins a partnership with Chapo Guzman. They make an alliance.
Okay.
He's in his 50s. He knows some guys in Colombia. He knows some guys in Venezuela. He can reestablish the ties because once Felix Gallardo got knocked off, those little satellite groups, they didn't have connections to the Colombians. They worked for him.
Right.
He dealt with them.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Hey, real quick, just wanted to let you guys know that we're looking for guests for the podcast. If you think you'd be a good guest or you know somebody, do me a favor. You can fill out the form. The link is in our description box, or you can just email me directly. Email is in the description box. So back to the video. You said that Palma was kind of excommunicated. Why did they come after him? If they wanted to kill him, or they just...
Pure spite.
Okay.
And the individual who killed the wife was an associate of the nephews, the Arianos. And so he knew that Felix Gallardo ordered it, but Gallardo is essentially in protective custody in prison.
Right.
Although he's technically incarcerated, he's still running his family's organization. He's operating with cell phones. Remember, this is now 89, 90.
Right.
You had cell phone technology. Whereas they were not able to be gotten to. So when Guido Palma reaches out to Chapo Guzman, they make a new alliance saying, hey, look, I'll handle the supply side because he knows some guys down in South America. You handle controlling through your toll bridge, your port of entry. Chapo Guzman wisely selected Guido Palma to be his partner. And for the first 5 years of the cartel's history, from let's say 1990 to 95, Guido Palma was actually in charge.
All right.
He's the older of the two. He had the gravitas. He was able to go and obtain the source of supply. More importantly, from Guzman's perspective, he knew that Guido Palma was the one man who would never cut a deal with the Arianos. That murder, the killing of his wife and his children,
sealed the deal, yeah.
meant that there was never going to be a negotiated settlement. It wasn't a business arrangement. We'll give you X number of dollars per unit to settle the debt. No. That killing actually triggered a war that lasted for 20 years. It didn't end until 2008. Thousands of men died behind the killing of his children. That was initially the precipitating factor. And so when Guzman selected Palma was like, look, I'll get the supply, you handle the smuggling, and I'm wiping out those guys.
Right.
Chapo just stood back. And that's the genesis of the Sinaloa arrangement. Now, there were other groups operating in Sinaloa, Zambada, Esparagoza, Beltr&aacute. They said, hey, well, you've got the toll bridge, we'll just all use you.
Right. And then they just, what do they just pay?
They pay piso.
Yeah.
But these guys, they formed like a little, there's always strength in numbers. Right. And so those organizations that were local to him, they bandied together. Now, what they did is initially you had the one state of Sinaloa, and within a year or two, they'd already moved out to about a half a dozen states. And that's where they stayed for a decade. You had Jalisco, Colima, Nayarit, Michoacan, and Durango. Well, all of the organizations in those territories came to Guzman's group and said, hey, we want our product taken across the border. Now, they charged them.
Yeah.
So that's a second revenue stream. You're making your money importing product for the Colombians. You're making your money distributing the product you get as payment to the Americans. And now you're getting the payment from all the other subsidiary organizations that want to use your toll bridge. And that was the genesis for Sinaloa. On the other hand, in Tijuana, they had a life of Riley. Sinaloa got to about 6, 7, 8 tons of Colombian product per month. In Tijuana, they started out with 20 tons. They were 3 times bigger. For the entire decade of the 1990s, this was the most powerful group in Mexico. They were literally 15 miles from the border.
Right.
And so they gave them direct access to Southern California and San Diego. Whereas Sinaloa, they're 800 miles to their port of entry. From there, they got to go to Los Angeles. Or they've got the second port of entry, which is in Agua Prieta, which was by Douglas, Arizona. That's on the New Mexico border. That's another 10 hours. Mm-hmm. So these guys had enormous disadvantage. One, they weren't a border state. Couldn't do anything about that. But 2, they were assigned and inherited 2 very, not very beneficial border crossings. They're small. Given the smallness, it increases the probability of getting detected.
Right. Because there's very little traffic.
Very little traffic.
Right?
In Tijuana, you got 50,000 cars every day.
Yeah, they just can't search all of them. They can't even search a fraction of it.
They can't. Look, the success rate was about 99%.
Right. It's pretty good for a product that has such a huge
markup,
yeah.
Let's take a look at it. Like if it's 8 metric tons, that's 8,000 units. Well, in order to get 8,000 units across the border, even if it's only 40 units at a time, that's just 200 cars.
Right.
How are they going to find 200 cars out of a sea of 50,000?
Right.
And let's say they break it up over the course of 2 days.
You can always give them somebody.
Well,
right?
no, they do.
They'll give them somebody.
They do.
Look, they've got a bust over here. Yeah. The border crossing guys, their customs or whatever, they're excited. They're all over here, and you.
Yeah,
right
that's they call it the torpedo.
Torpedo.
Where they'll send like a decoy load of, marijuana,
right?
Relatively inexpensive, and of course that'll get all the border guards all running over there. We got a big bust. Meanwhile, they just start pushing through.
Right.
But even then, they don't even necessarily need to do that because the probabilities are so in their favor. And it's only with respect to the bigger loads where they'll do the decoys. But Tijuana didn't have to go with the bigger loads because they just had that free flow of traffic. It's Sinaloa that was at the disadvantage. And so from the very beginning, by 1991, 1990 was the full year that it operated. By 1991, you already had Guzman's operatives in Tijuana operating clandestinely. And shortly, they got, identified. Those 6 got killed. And the Arianos, they remember, when you have control of a plaza, that means you not only have the border crossing, but that means you have the endorsement of local law enforcement. And so your loads are protected. Non-paying participants in the market, their loads are susceptible to getting confiscated. So that's when you see the police making busts.
Right.
They're just busting the guys that are on the payroll.
Right. And this is, you're saying from the Mexican side?
No, the Mexican side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so,
I can't believe you would suggest that Mexicans would be corrupt.
and then the loads that they knock off, after they get the big bus, they take the pictures, blah, blah, blah. Then they turn around and they sell it to the local plaza boss.
Right.
So it pays to pay for the service. And what?
Have you seen, I'm going to say it wrong, Suricata or what is, you know what I'm talking about? God, I can't believe it. You got to see this. I'm going to send you this movie. You had to have seen it in Coleman, and there's 2 of them now. I'm gonna send.
I didn't watch television.
I'm gonna send it to you, and you're gonna be like, "Whoa, this is great!" Or you'll pick holes in it. Either way, it'll be fine. You'll like it. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, okay. So the point being is, once Tijuana discovered that, hey, you've got your operatives in our city, that means they're pushing through loads without paying their piso. Right. So they kill those 6 guys and tell Guzman, hey, stop sending your people over.
They don't get a fine or
no. So then a second group gets knocked off, but these are like 2 high-ranking guys. Well, after these 2, that's when Guzman says, okay, now they're going to start shooting it out. And they were able to gather some intel that some of the Arianos are going to be partying in Puerto Vallarta. This is now 1992.
Right.
And Chapo Guzman sends a hit squad with Palma, 40 men dressed up as police officers. They show up at the nightclub, and
what's wrong with filing a lawsuit? Like, I don't understand. It's always straight to the violence with these guys.
Well, no, see, that's prior to the killing of Guado Palma's wife.
They would have had a sit down.
They would have had, that changed
the dynamic of
the entire
rules.
industry.
Right.
The Arianos, up until that point, murder was the last resort.
Yeah.
Arianos used it as a tool.
Right.
And of course, like I said, Guado Palma wasn't going to negotiate no matter what. And so he sends
these cops.
He sends
dressed up as cops.
For all we know, they may have been cops.
Okay. Yeah.
And they shoot up the nightclub, end up killing like 12 civilians. They miss
collateral damage.
They miss the Ariano. Like they get a bunch of it.
Now you're just an idiot.
They get the bodyguards.
Oh God.
But Ariano's able to, while his bodyguards are fighting him off, boom, he sneaks out the window in the bathroom.
Oh my God. Okay.
And so now that was in like late 92.
Right.
Now you fast forward to the spring of 93, which was a very significant time period because you had 2 events that occurred. For the previous 3 years, Sinaloa, unlike Tijuana, because they didn't have the high flow of traffic, they went for the larger loads. 6, 7, 8-ton shipments at a time. And they'd come up with a very clever mechanism in which they were concealing the contraband inside food products that were being brought to Los Angeles. First, Los Angeles is a predominantly Hispanic city. You got 1 million little Mexican markets.
Right.
And so they're just importing Mexican goods to sell at these markets. Well, that's how the material was getting brought into the country. Now, that gets knocked off by the DEA in the spring of 93. A month later, they discovered a first subterranean tunnel. Now, they had previously found a tunnel in Douglas, Arizona, the Agua Prieta border crossing, the one that was 10 hours away from LA.
Right.
So they said, well, screw that. We're not going to keep building infrastructure out there. They just went and built a clandestine tunnel under Tijuana territory. They were completely in the dark, made no money from this venture. And naturally, that's what kicked off the war. They send a group of hitmen to go try to take out Chapo Guzman because Guzman, it was his tunnel.
Okay.
He handled the smuggling.
Right.
Palma handled the supply side. So they target Guzman. They send 20 guys.
So they figure out that it's Guzman, and Guzman isn't supposed to be there.
No,
okay. Just making sure.
Yeah, his border crossing is 30 miles outside of Tijuana.
Right.
So
he's not supposed to be in our area. We find out they have this
tunnel,
fucking tunnel, and so what do they have? They have engineers where do they get people like? No offense, I can't dig a tunnel that's probably not going to collapse.
Yeah, they bring in guys from Germany.
Okay.
And so they brought in not only the German engineers, but they brought in the craftsmen necessary to create it, give it the structural integrity, give it the ventilation system, give it the locomotion system. These are, $1 million
enterprise.
per tunnel.
Yeah.
And they'll usually
pesos.
They'll build like an array.
Right.
And so you have like a 3-tunnel setup. So they'll be activating, the Alpha tunnel will be operating, Bravo on standby, Charlie's mothballed.
Right.
Bravo, Alpha gets knocked off, activate Bravo, Charlie's on standby, they're building Delta. And so they just keep rolling, boom, 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 boom. And of course, they're not supposed to be doing any of this because it's not their territory.
Right.
So the Arianos send a group of hitmen to go catch Chapo Guzman. They knew that he was going to be flying out of the airport in Guadalajara. And so when they made the move at the airport, he's driving a particular type of vehicle that they knew the car he was going to be in. So the hitmen riddle the vehicle full of bullets. Unfortunately, it's the wrong car.
Who's in that car?
An archbishop from the Catholic Church.
The archbishop for the Catholic, like that.
That's like the highest guy in Guadalajara. Guadalajara is the second largest city in Mexico, and it's also a cultural center for the country.
Right, wrong car.
And so, yeah, of course, they both happen to be driving like the same white, Chevy Marquise or some whatever the hell it was.
Right.
And so that triggers an enormous response. Because Mexico, although very corrupt, is also very Catholic.
Right.
Like this is the line that got crossed.
Yeah. So the government's furious.
The government's just absolutely infuriated. And so on every level, you had the overland route gets knocked off by the DEA. The subterranean route gets knocked off by customs. This incident with the Archbishop happens. All of a sudden, like we were in LA, prices skyrocket.
Right.
They go from $14.5 a unit. Now they're charging $18.5 in a matter of, weeks.
But I mean, why? Because immediately a war.
Supply side. Yeah, well, supply side issues.
Okay.
Whenever there's a major disruption, people start hoarding.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you don't want to sell something today for $16.5, yet 2 weeks from now you can get $19 for. And so it has this effect where it accelerates. Prices start skyrocketing because until a new setup is established and people know that the supply is back online, it creates an enormous drought type of condition.
Okay.
And so once the killing of the Cardinal occurs, Guzman takes off. The government just slams everybody, Mexican government. That's precipitated the price results. Well, when Guzman gets arrested a month later, he gets charged for the killing of the Cardinal. He's like, hey, well, hold on a second. They were trying to get me. Like, he's the victim here.
Right.
And so after a little bit of investigation, they determined that, oh, yeah, he was the target. This, of course, makes the Arianos public enemy number one now. Guzman, unfortunately, gets thrown into jail anyway. Like, okay, well, you're innocent of this killing, but we're giving you 20 years for the drug activity. So now he goes out of the way. Boom. But Palma, at this point, is completely in charge. His number two is now Mayo Zambada. Because Palma is spending most of his time in combat.
Right.
So he's kind of delegating to some of the other guys, like, hey, you guys handle the dope. I'm over here busy. And so this continues for another year. That's when you get the second big knockoff. This was a significant event in the backdrop of my case, where in the autumn of 94, a shipment gets knocked off. And at the Tecate border crossing, 10 tons. And
10 tons of product.
That was the last of the big loads that came from Sinaloa. From that point forward, they started using the diversification model. Build a fleet of 200 cars,
right,
40 units per car, and just send the cars.
What was the 10 tons in? Was it?
I don't know the circumstances surrounding how.
I was just wondering if it was a truck or if it was.
Well, it had to be a truck, of course.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I remember. I don't know if you're going to mention this story about the hollowed out telephone poles that are being trucked down.
Yeah, but that's still trucking. They were using tractor trailers in that particular circumstance. And you're talking about Vicente Guerrero. Guerrero's an interesting character because later on, Guerrero's wife was brothers with the head Zeta. And Guerrero was dealing directly with Ociel Cardenas. He's an individual that pops up later on in the story because this is Gulf Cartel. But just to complete the thought, they were using tractor trailers with the long trailers used to move those light posts.
Right.
These are 30 feet, 40 feet in length.
Yeah.
And what was very clever about Guerrero's operation, and particularly the reason why he got slammed with 35 years, was because his construction and trucking company were paying the Texas Highway Patrol to provide escorts for the trucks.
So the Texas Highway Patrol is they're escorting loads of product coming from Mexico. Yeah. These huge concrete light poles that are hollowed out. They just stuff them full of product.
Yeah, it was a three tons per truckload.
Yeah, so they're.
And then you got the sheriff's department. You got the two, Texas State Trooper in the front, Texas State Trooper in the back, then a little truck with the wide load. And so you got police escort, and they're bringing 3 tons at a time. Boom, 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 going from Brownsville to Houston.
Ballsy, yeah.
35 years for that.
Yeah, and just for being clever. Is that an enhancement?
Well, it was
That's a 12-point enhancement.
It was that issue with respect to the Texas State Troopers, and then they had a second run where they were going from.
Oh, is this the bus?
Where they were really going up to Corpus Christi, and in Corpus Christi they had school buses that they were using to move the product from Corpus Christi up into Houston. And so, they would take the school bus, go and pick up.
It's kids with special needs kids and take them to. He didn't want to say it. Special needs kids and they take them to the zoo. So they're all on this bus that's filled with product.
They drop them off at the zoo.
Spend a few hours.
Take the truck over to the shop, lift the frame up off, lift the frame up off the carriage, access the compartments, pull the material, reassemble everything, get back, pick up the kids from the zoo, run them back down to Corpus Christi. And so it was that double whammy that altered Guerrero getting 35 years. But so back to with Sinaloa. So in the autumn of 94, that load gets knocked off.
Right.
Which precipitates them to start going, okay, you know what, we're going to do the smaller loads. Now it requires a lot more infrastructure. Now you got to have 200 drivers, you got to have 100 cars, you got to have warehouses, but you can't afford to sustain these, 10 metric ton losses.
Right.
And so that's where you had the transition over by 95 to where you had the smaller loads. Also at that point, that's the year that NAFTA took effect. And that really changed everything because now you had a tremendous amount of traffic coming back and forth. And it made the principal border crossings that much more valuable because people focus on the Tijuana border crossing with the civilians. Well, there's a second border crossing that's commercial. Well, the Tijuana one, Nuevo Laredo, those become crown jewels because they've got an enormous amount of trucking coming through. And the trucks, you're not doing 40 units per car. That's where you had Guerrero coming with 3 tons.
Right.
They're going through those passes. And that's later on what's going to really kick things off. It was a mad scramble for those type of assets. Because, what people don't necessarily understand about cartels is they group together in order to control certain key assets. So for
areas or regions?
In Sinaloa, they wanted control of Jalisco because Guadalajara is not only a major metropolitan area, but more importantly, it's the money laundering capital of the world. Well, you need access to those money launderers.
Right.
Once you go outside of the city, literally there are fields where you've got the trailers for tractor trailers. You've got trailers parked underground. It's just buried in the desert, filled with cash. Mm. You get $1 billion to $2 billion a month coming into Guadalajara in cash. Well, there's an entire infrastructure designed just to surface that capital. Well, that can't be replicated. So that's a tremendous asset you want to control. Next to Jalisco, you got the state of Colima. Well, Colima's got the largest port on the West Coast. It's critical. Not only could you bring material in from Colombia, but more importantly, later on, as they start moving into manufacturing their own product, they need to get the precursors in from China. So Colima's got a port. Michoacan's got a port. Those are the two biggest ports on the West Coast. You fight for control of the ports. You fight for control of the border crossings. Other key assets are key corrupted political officials. After Guzman gets knocked off, Miles Zambada steps up, really assumes control operationally for the cartel. Well, he's in a business relationship with a man named Armando Valencia and another man named Armando Carrillo. Well, from 1993 to 1997, these men put together an operation resulting in the importation of 30 tons a month. Just those three organizations. Mm-hmm. And it was, the most secure importation operation in the history of the world. And it was secured because they had control of the generals, one of which had responsibility for maintaining the integrity of Mexican airspace. Well, the American government went in, built a state-of-the-art radar system so that the Mexicans can identify planes flying in from Colombia that aren't properly signaled. Well, if you've got control of the guy that's responsible for an operation...
Yeah, he lets this one in.
He lets this one in. That's right. Meanwhile, on the supply side, you had Zambada controlling the general in Guadalajara, who maintained control over that military zone. Well, he had one of his buddies controlling an air base in the Mexican state of Sonora. So now you had planes flying in from Colombia, getting greenlit by one general, landing at another military base, greenlit by the second general. And so, and when I say general, I mean he's got all his colonels, his captains, everybody down the line is getting a piece.
Right.
So they're getting millions of dollars a month in payments. Amado Carrillo, at his peak, was paying about $500 million a year in bribes. That's just greasing the wheels.
Right.
And so you started getting these shipments where they bought a fleet of Boeing 727s, gutted them, turned them into cargo planes, and just started flying airliners. They're carrying 13, 14, 15 tons per load. They're getting greenlit by the general. They're getting when they land, you got the people unloading them are uniformed military personnel. And so it was just an impenetrable operation. That fell apart when the general that was responsible for greenlighting the landings, he gets selected to be their drug czar. So in 1996, he gets elevated to becoming the chief narcotics fighter for the country. And the whole time, they end up discovering that he's living in one of Amado Carrillo's high-rises. It was like, what are you doing, man?
Right.
So, they had to shut down that operation.
Right.
But they had that 5-year run where it demonstrated the power of having control of assets. And by having those two generals, they were able to get away with this. Nobody else could do that kind of a thing.
Right.
And so now most of the assets they fight over are physical assets, ports, border crossings. And in 1995, after that last big loss, you had the switch over to one, they're going to be sending over smaller loads. And two, you had the elevation of Zambada essentially taking over control. Well, he fully took over control in the spring because Palma, then the head of the cartel, gets into his Learjet crashed, and he survives the plane crash. And so he's able to get away. Of course, the military and everybody responds because they just see an airplane crash. They don't know it's Obama's plane.
Right.
And so he ends up actually getting away, and they find him later on, convalescing. So now he joins Guzman in prison. So you got these two guys out of the way. Zambada takes over. And this is the first of the golden eras because he's not caught up in all the bullshit and the drama. So while the war continued, he focused more on the business. And so that's where you saw the massive growth in the Sinaloa operation happen under Zambada. And this is when he had that 30-ton a month operation going on with Carrillo and Valencia. Well, independent of that, he formed another relationship with a guy named Ignacio Coronell. Now, Nacho Coronell was operating in Jalisco. Well, he maintained a fleet of tuna boats. And so while you've got the 30 tons a month coming in through the air route, he had another 10 tons a month coming in through the maritime route. And so now they're hitting on both cylinders. In addition to those two, you've got an individual named Armando Valencia. Now, Valencia was actually one of the principal players on the supply side in my case. And Valencia, not only was he, for that era, an extraordinary trafficker, he's the one who brokered together the arrangement between Zambada and Cartel. He's also the individual that had the visionary to see the value in synthetic compounds. So he entered into a relationship with a guy named F&eacute, who was another one of the ultimate suppliers on my case. And they started manufacturing what was essentially...
Right.
And so for the first few years, they had complete control of this market. And so, F&eacute had his connections, which, when Sinaloa selected Los Angeles, they divided the city up into basically different regions. And so, Zambada, Guzman, and Palma had their operations based in LA County proper. Like Zambada ran his operation out of my hometown of West Covina. And so West Covina was ground zero, essentially. It's like, how could I say this? West Covina is the drug trafficking, what Palo Alto is to Silicon Valley.
Right.
And those three groups really took over the LA County underground drug market. The fourth organization that operated in LA was Valencia. Well, Valencia's was down in Orange County. And so it's Valencia's group that supplied the large quantities of the synthetic material to LA traffickers, like the guys in my case.
Right.
And so the other thing to understand about Orange County is Orange County was home to a large Asian community. Now we've got 3 or 4 Asian clusters in the greater LA area. And in the LA area, we had 4 triads operating. Well, the triad that operated in Orange County was a group called the 14K. And so Valencia's group is operating in Orange County. They developed ties with Chinese gangsters based in Orange County. Now they got to connect in China for the chemicals. And so they started bringing in just tons of precursor chemicals into Mexico, producing the material, bringing it up to Los Angeles, distributing it all through their Orange County distributors. And the difference between that particular material and the product from the Colombians is that in the Colombian context, the Mexicans are middlemen. They're coming out of pocket a significant amount of money to obtain the material. Then they got to incur the costs with transporting, protection, security, all that nonsense. With respect to the material they're manufacturing, on the other hand, it's nearly all profits.
Right.
And so what you saw was an enormous amount of revenue going now to Sinaloa without a corresponding increase. Tijuana was still much bigger. The Gulf was still much bigger. But they had all of the synthetic market locked up. And so by 1997, this is where in the United States, it started becoming an issue. You started getting a lot of law enforcement attention where they were saying, hey, we got to stop this stuff coming up from Mexico. And that's the year that F&eacute, and they brought a lot of pressure on it. F&eacute gets taken up. He gets busted. So now Valencia is like, okay, well, he's already overseeing this massive operation with the Colombians. Now he's overseeing this massive operation with the synthetics. So he forms a business partnership with Nacho Coronell. Well, Nacho Coronell takes it to a level that they didn't think was even possible. He brings in chemists from Israel, and they reconfigure the labs. They go from producing what before had been previously bulk powder material to now it's more powerful crystallized form.
Right. These are the super labs that are in the jungles, right?
Well, in the villages outside of, once you leave Guadalajara, jungle is a misnomer. It's not necessarily jungles, but look, the city of Guadalajara.
I saw pictures, they looked like jungles.
Well, you saw pictures of the Colombian operations.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Mexican guys don't do that. They just pay for protection. They got that warehouse. They got that building. And so, but yeah, so they have enormous labs that got constructed primarily, they came in with the Israelis. They came up with the configuration. They developed the formulas. They taught the locals how to use it. And they started producing material on an industrial scale. And so at this point, you had Zambada essentially consolidating the Colombian-related aspect. You had Nacho Coronell consolidating the synthetic aspect. And at this point, Coronell becomes so powerful, like he's literally the second, if not the third most powerful drug lord in the Western Hemisphere. Because he still got the tuna boats, but he's got control over the synthetics. And that's 90% profits.
Well, what about poor Guzman? I mean,
he's still in prison.
I feel bad for him. Are we
well, remember, don't forget, prison in Mexico is not.
It's not.
It's not Coleman.
No.
Prison in Mexico.
We've seen pictures.
Prison in Mexico they live better in prison than 90% of the men in this country.
Yeah. We had a buddy in prison who literally showed us, the photo albums. He had like multiple photo albums that are this thick, filled with photos of him in Mexican. This is a cartel member who's showing him in prison with photograph. He's photographing in, which is insane. And I mean, they're drinking Corona. He's bringing in prostitutes. His meals are catered.
Yeah, they got every day. Every meal was catered. So they've brought in catered food 3 times a day. They bring in hookers for 3 or 4 days at a time. They bring in 2 or 3 of them at a time.
Then it's all allowed.
It's all permitted. Well, they're paying $5,000 a week to live on that range.
Yeah, they live on. So like, if you have different units set up, they have their own unit, like their own area, their own section where it's just cartel members.
Yeah, and so they're paying $5,000 a week, and for that they get the privileges of, alcohol, drugs, women, catered food. They run their businesses from there. He ultimately got charged. When he got charged, it was for running a $300 million conspiracy out of prison.
Yeah, he's got cell phones. He's answering calls. He
ended up, he did 10 years in a Mexican prison, of which he did like 6.
Right.
He had like 7 kids in 6 years.
And then they had to move him to,
Then they brought him to America to serve his time.
Serve the time for what he had
And he
done.
was not happy at all.
Right, no.
Like, oh, this sucks.
Still living pretty good. Still, even, I mean, not that it's not Mexico, but he's still got all of his food's catered. He didn't go into the chow hall unless it's a special meal. He's got guys cooking for him, doing his laundry, making his bed. Am I right? No,
yeah, no, of course, yeah.
Okay? But yeah, it wasn't as good as Mexico. There's no hookers or anything. You're not bringing in your wife can't come visit you for 5 days.
But they wouldn't have the wives come.
No. Didn't he father a couple of kids or something?
Yeah, like half a dozen kids
while he's in prison.
Yeah. And so it was and that's the same thing with Guzman. I mean, there's numerous stories, and you can look at. I'm sure you can watch stories on YouTube recreating the events, but it's literally, they bring in groups, bands, they're playing corridos for him. They're having 30, 40, 50 people banquets. And, but he's still running his business.
Right.
However, the thing about Guzman you got to understand is he was actually the smallest distributor of the factions.
Right.
Like, he was the largest of the smugglers. But Zambada's distribution network was much larger. Valencia's was much larger. The distribution end is different than the importation. The government likes to just conflate everybody as being drug traffickers. Well, there are different roles within.
Right.
A divorce lawyer is not a criminal defense lawyer and is not a bankruptcy lawyer. Well, there are different specialties.
Yeah.
Well, his primary specialty was overseeing the importation of the material. So now, and the majority of the product he imports wasn't his.
Right.
Now, the government, of course, says, well, we're going to attribute 200,000 units to him. That's everybody's 200,000 units. That's just getting dumped on the guy.
Yeah, but he was also the more flashy, the one that kind of got the public's eye, and he got...
Yes, and that was, Zambada.
Like, nobody knows about Zambada. Like, nobody. He's
how about Valencia?
He's driving an old pickup truck around Sinaloa, doesn't bother anybody.
Yeah, same thing with Valencia. Valencia was probably the largest drug trafficker who has never achieved any measure of notoriety.
Right.
He's, like I said, 30 tons a month. Nobody ever heard of him. I met him.
There's like what, one or two photos of him.
Yeah, there's like total. 1 or 2 photos of him. There's a few photos of Valencia. But,
Guzman.
Oh, yeah.
He's posing with people. Like, he's like going, you know.
Yeah, they got the photo of him with the Hummer holding a machine gun in front of him. It's like, come on, man, what are you doing? And so by the turn of the century, things were hitting on all cylinders on the Sinaloa front. Now, where things get really interesting is what happened out in the Gulf. Because in the late 1990s, you had a man named Ociel Cardenas, and he rose to challenge control of the Gulf Cartel. Now, the Gulf Cartel was much bigger than Sinaloa. You know, Tijuana's doing 20 tons a month. The Gulf's doing 20 tons a month.
Right.
You know, Sinaloa is importing a lot of material, but it's going to different groups. Like, individually, these other groups were much more powerful. Well, Ociel Cardenas made a move to take over control of the Gulf. However, there were various factions within that particular syndicate that were very powerful. And so what Cardenas did is he entered into a relationship with a former military personnel. He was a special forces individual for the Mexican Special Forces. And he goes to him and says, hey, look, I need to put together a security detail. Because he knew it was going to be a rough move. Like, these other guys aren't going to just go along with him taking over. And so he says, I need to put together a security detail. Where can I find some highly trained men? He's like, well, we'll get them out of the military. And so this individual named Decina, he was later on became known as Z1.
Right. I was going to say, is this Z1, the very first?
He was the very first Zeta. And so he reaches out to his group of associates within the Mexican military, and he persuades 30 of them to defect. Now, these are all special forces. These are guys that were trained in the School of the Americas by the Israelis. They're trained by American Special Forces at Fort Bragg. And what Cardenas did that was interesting is he took the very men that were trained for counterinsurgency and counter-narcotics and put them in charge of being his enforcement arm. And he was able to first subdue the other Gulf cartel factions in order to consolidate control. Then, with this 30-man unit having achieved its primary objective, he said, you know what? Let's scale up the enforcement arm. Now, they end up paying a lot more money per man than the Mexican government. So they get 300 more guys. So now you've got 300 trained men. These aren't undisciplined thugs. These aren't gangbangers.
Yeah, these guys have been
straight
trained.
special forces coming, you know, these are Army Rangers.
Right.
You know, they all got they're using military call signs. They've got a military culture. You got the commander, you got the captain, you got the lieutenant. I mean, they maintain that structure.
Yeah, you have military tactics.
You've got military tactics, you got military grade equipment. And so you've got this group of 300 trained military personnel led by a contingency of 30 special forces. Then they bring in approximately 1,000 military personnel from Guatemala. So they end up building what's essentially like a 1,500-man army. And Ociel Cardenas unleashes them. They ultimately go on to become famous as Los Zetas.
Right.
And they were a paramilitary force unmatched in the annals of organized crime. And what they were able to do, particularly in those first few years, struck terror into all of the other groups because they just started rolling through territory. And not only were their tactics superior, achieving a high degree of success, they were vicious. They were trained in psychological warfare. So when they attended to their missions, they engaged in a level of savagery to intimidate the opposing groups. And so this caused enormous panic because they were literally just rolling up ports of entry. Eagle Pass. I mean, like, boom, all the guys in, the rest of them in Texas. Now they're coming up against the Juarez cartel, which is in Texas. Meanwhile, another contingency is coming in through the Northwest. Sinaloa was operating in Monterrey. That falls. They're coming into Durango. And the Arianos, being opportunistic, they decide, you know what? Let's form an alliance. So the Tijuana cartel forms an alliance with the Gulf cartel. They come together and say, you know what? Let's squeeze out these guys in the middle and we'll just keep it all. So now, of course, Juarez and Sinaloa, they already had business ties. But at this point now, they're engaged in a fight for survival.
Hey, if you like the video, please check out my Patreon. We're going to put special content for some of the stories that aren't quite making this overall arc. Kind of like some side discussions. We're going to put that on Patreon. So if you join Patreon for $10 a month, you can go and get that exclusive content. Back to the video. Well, I mean, I know you're going to get to like the different like, you know.
Well, now we're going to get to the Federation consolidating. But before, we're still in the late 90s with the Zetas. Do you want to make any comments? Do you want to talk about it?
I mean, I know that I know they're shooting helicopters out of the skies. I mean, I know that every time that
was a different group.
A different group, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I know that, you know, I kind of know that they were, like you just said, they were vicious and they're protecting.
Okay.
What was the one where they protected the guy? They caught him in the building, and they're sending troops in to try and surround the building and get this guy. And they're firing in the building, and he's asking for the Zetas to come in or somebody to come in and rescue him. And there's a huge fight for like 2 days or something.
Yeah, that's this guy. That happens in 03.
Oh, okay, so that hasn't happened.
Haven't happened yet.
Okay, cool. Well, see, we're getting to that stuff.
Okay,
I'm good.
And what was interesting about the Zetas is they had an esprit de corps, and so not only were they advancing successfully militarily, they demonstrated to the other groups how important it was to have a sense of cohesion. When their guys got knocked off, I mean, they orchestrated major prison breaks. Like they're going and getting their men out.
Right.
They didn't leave nobody behind. If one of their men got killed, they went and they got back the corpse. And so it created a dynamic that it caused the other groups to say, hey, we got to up our game.
Right.
Meanwhile, by the dawn of millennium, panic had already begun to set in, because unless they're able to stop this juggernaut, they're all going to be under the control of the Gulf. At that point, and of course, the Gulf's just going to wipe everybody out because they're going to take over.
Right.
And so that's when Miles Zambada, really out of desperation, came up with the plan that was both bold and simple. And so it was going to be a two-pronged attack against the Gulf and Tijuana. But in order for him to pull it off, he was going to need his paisa, Chapo Guzman.
Right.
So now Guzman's sitting in prison, having the time of his life, hookers, the whole nine. He gets the call saying, hey, we need you.
Oh, are you serious?
so he says, look, we're gonna get you, we're busting you out.
But I was halfway through this sentence.
He's about 8 years into his bid.
Yeah, I'm ready to,
so now he's going to
for a halfway house.
He's going to have warrants out for his arrest. He was like, damn it. All right. So they break Guzman out. And Zambada's brothers waiting for him, put him on a helicopter. They whisk him away. Zambada explains the situation, saying, hey, we're about to lose everything. He says, I need you for two reasons. One, Guzman was vicious.
Right.
Now, he may not have been a Huero Palma.
Right.
But Guzman had not only a willingness to do whatever was necessary, that also included using a particular asset that Guzman had. And what Guzman had that other people didn't was an attorney named Humberto Loya.
Oh, yeah, I know. This is good, bro. This is good. Okay, I
and
remember.
The lawyer was secretly an informant for the Drug Enforcement Administration. And so one of the ways Sinaloa was ultimately able to protect themselves was by not only putting together their own military task force, but they were able to create an ally with a much more powerful force, even stronger than the Zetas, their Uncle Sam.
Yeah.
And so they were able to manipulate the American law enforcement community. But at the beginning, Zambada says, hey, look, bust out Guzman. They get together. They decide, okay, well, you know what we need to do? We need to strengthen ourselves. So Guzman and Zambada, they bring in Nacho Coronell.
Well, how did they get Guzman out? Guzman out.
They ended up bribing the warden.
Right.
And a number of the officers. They put him in what was a laundry cart, and they rolled him out. Like,
just throw some clothes over him, let him lay down, wheel him out. And there was like, what, a helicopter or something?
A helicopter. Well, I mean, they had to get him in a van, drive him to an airport, and they got him into a helicopter and whisked him away.
Nice.
And so, yeah.
Just admire that.
And so they bring on board Nacho Coronell. They explain, hey, look, you're just in the same boat as us. And Coronell says, all right, I'm in. So now Coronell brings in Armando Valencia, who at this point was his business partner on the synthetics. So you've got like 4 of the guys coming together. Then they bring in Chapo Guzman's cousin, Alfredo and Arturo Beltr&aacute, another group of Sinaloa and kingpins. Now this group comes together. So these 5 say, okay, we're going to form our own little group and we're going to reach out to the other individuals that were in trouble. So they reach out to the Carrillo Fuentes family in Juarez. Amado Carrillo had passed away, but his younger brother had taken over. So now they come in with Vicente and say, hey, you're in direct crosshairs. Right. So he jumps at the opportunity to join.
Right.
So then these 6 guys hold a conference attended to by 25 other kingpins where everyone agrees to say, okay, you know what, we're going to form what ultimately became known as El Cartel de Pacifico. The Pacific Cartel.
Right.
Or known just within the group as El Federación, the Federation.
The Federation.
And so this federation was essentially a group of 25 to 30 separate organizations that came together for the purposes of defending themselves against Tijuana and the Gulf, and in particular, the Zetas. And so Chapo Guzman, Nacho Coronell, and Arturo Beltr&aacute led the military wing. And so they had a group of enforcers just targeting lower level and mid-level operatives for both of the respective cartels.
Right.
On the other hand, for the leadership, that was the more sensitive information. That's where Zambada had Chapo Guzman contacting Humberto Loya. The lawyer is meeting with the DEA and U.S. Attorney's Office, Department of Justice officials in San Diego, feeding them information. That information now goes to D.C. See, now, when the Department of Justice contacts the Attorney General's office in Mexico, it's different than it's coming from the local police.
Right.
Like, they didn't trust the police in Tijuana. 80% of the police officers were on the take.
Right.
And so there are units within the Mexican government that are properly vetted, that they know haven't been corrupted. And so when something comes in from like the Attorney General of the United States directly, they dispatch that particular unit. They keep the locals in the dark.
Right.
And Chapo Guzman's attorney began feeding them the information that allowed them to start targeting the leaders. And so in 2002, they set up a trap where Zambada was going to be in the city of Monchi vacationing with his family. And they let that information get known to someone they thought was a double agent. That guy feeds the information to the Arianos. So Ramon Ariano and a group of hitmen come to Monchi to assassinate Zambada. Well, Zambada's got his military personnel waiting for him.
Right.
Including the federales. So the federales pull over the vehicle. They got into a firefight.
Right.
And all of them get killed. So they took out the second in command of the Tijuana cartel. Okay. The leader of the cartel, shortly thereafter, was spending time with a woman outside of Tijuana who may have been his mistress. They obtained that information. The cartel's paying top dollar for information at this point.
Right.
And most of the people that did the betraying were actually women. A lot of the escorts, a lot of the hookers on the side, big 6-figure payouts if you know where he's going to be at this day.
Yeah.
And so they were able to get the information on where Ariano was going to be. That information goes to the lawyer, to the Department of Justice. The American Attorney General calls the Mexican Attorney General. Boom, they go get him. A year later, they take out.
So they go get him. They go grab him.
They go grab him. He's in jail.
They erase him. They arrest him. He's in jail.
He's in custody. Yes.
Okay.
And so,
by the way, you got to know too, Colby. I'm sorry, but like the lawyer's wanted, right? So the lawyer.
That's why.
The lawyer's going back and forth between.
Well, he's an American lawyer,
right,
in San Diego with warrants out for his arrest. He's been laundering drug money. And he was the contact on the American side, moving cash, setting up dummy companies.
And he's given this information.
So he's like walking into the DEA headquarters when they got warrants out for their arrest. It's like me, shortly after I got indicted, I get arrested. Well, I called a friend who was a cop, who called the crooked federal agent in my case. Boom, they get me released. Like, those are the kind of moves you're able to make if you've got the kind of relationship where they're going to protect you.
So, I mean, that's like.
So, in my circumstance, if you maintain a relationship with the corrupt agent, he'll call and say, hey, release him. Boom, I get released.
So
whereas with respect to Humberto Loya, he's in the same circumstance where he's coming in saying, hey, look, I got information. And they know the information is coming from Chapo Guzman. Like, this is Guzman's lawyer. He got charged with Guzman. He's saying, hey, look, Ariano's going to be at this house in this little village or this little town.
Yeah, it's going to be right here. This probably, probably Tuesday night. And they're like, all right, cool. Aren't you wanted? Like, hey, come on, stop it. Enough with that. We've had enough of that. And he just walks on out.
And so literally they were able to orchestrate the arrest and essentially decapitate the Tijuana cartel through information being fed to the Americans, who then manipulated their lackeys in the Mexican government to go take out the leadership. And so they were able to remove the leaders through using their enemy.
Right.
On the one hand, and they were able to wipe out the lower level guys through, essentially military action.
Yeah.
In the 18-month period after the formation of the Confederation, there was like 2,000 guys that were Tijuana operatives who ended up getting arrested. Now, they weren't, but the leaders, that information came from the Sinaloa operatives. But when you take out the plaza boss, he loses 50 guys with him.
Right.
When you take out the lieutenant, they take out 100. You know what I mean? It's just these massive arrests were happening because of the ability of Sinaloa to manipulate the Americans to take out their enemies.
Right.
And so once the leadership was decapitated, that created a destabilization. That's when Zambada says, okay, boom, send Herman Magaña. Now here comes Paisa. He comes in with the military wing. And so now it's a battle for the next year. But by 2004, Magaña's got control. Effectively, he's got control to where now they're able to say, we're going to push through all Sinaloa loads. So now they've got control of the San Diego-Tijuana corridor. Independent of this, you've got the second military operation going on with Arturo Beltr&aacute, where now he says, you know what? They're going into Texas. So they attack the Gulf in their backyard. Well, before that, after they take out Tijuana, a year later, the same circumstance happened where they were able to get the information identifying where the head of the Gulf cartel, Ocio Cardenas, was going to be holed up at. Now understand, he's got like 50 Zetas with him. And so the Americans were able to get the information, fed it to their lackeys in the Mexican government. Here comes the Mexicans, like 500 strong. And this was the incident you were talking about, where they're saying, hey, send more guys.
Yeah, they have a battle. They have there's like a huge firefight.
It's like 2 days.
Yeah.
That's how much ammunition these guys carry with them. It's like 2 days worth of gunfight. You've got like reinforcements showing up. Zeta reinforcement. They just, it was just but obviously you're not going to be able to overpower, if an army shows up.
Yeah. All right. But I mean, they're trying.
Yeah, but they're trying. They hold them off for 2 days. And ultimately they're able to catch Cardenas. And
he's literally making phone calls like, send more guys. I need 100 more guys. It's like a little battle going on in this area with the military. And that's...
And, there are videos on YouTube that have battles. There's a famous battle at the St. Gertrude Ranch that was owned by another Sinaloa drug lord who was operating in the Texas side. And it's just battles. It's just literally, dozens of Zetas hold up, shooting it out with hundreds of police officers. And you would think, these are the kind of things you see in the movies. Yeah. This is actually that. There's just rocket launchers, grenades, they're throwing grenades at each other, and it's just pure insanity. And so they end up knocking off Ocio Cardenas. They take him into custody. And so the same dynamic is in play. They sense an opening, boom. Now they send Beltr&aacute in with his enforcement group. So now they're running a war on two fronts. And although Sinaloa was technically outgunned, they had the Americans that were assisting them. And so that was the X factor that the other cartels never really anticipated. And so with the Americans orchestrating the removal of the leadership, the smaller group were able to come in and just start rolling up territory. They were able to push back the Zetas, and they were able to take over Tijuana and at least secure their eastern flank. Now, at that point, we're talking 2003, 2004, this starts the golden era for Sinaloa. because by now they've got from Tijuana all the way to El Paso. So there's 17 border crossings. That's all theirs. And they're able to create an organization that the government later on characterized as the largest and most powerful drug syndicate in the history of the world. And that run ran from, let's say, 2004 to about 2010 with a hiccup in 2008.
What was the hiccup?
Well, we don't want to get to that far because that's jumping ahead.
All right.
So now in 2004, this was the first of the scandalous moves. I think like you would think that you got to the position where things are stabilizing, let's just focus on the business. They can't do it.
All right.
And this is where, Guzman's just a knucklehead. So he decides, hey, you know what? Him, his cousin, Arturo Beltr&aacute, and they talked to the guy out in Juarez. His name was Juan Jose Esparragoza. And, Esparragoza is an interesting character in that he was an extraordinary trafficker who served as number 2 to Amado Carrillo. And Amado Carrillo's right-hand man, of course, was his brother, Vicente. And so when Amado Carrillo was the drug lord who passed away while he was having plastic surgery.
Oh, okay.
Okay, in 1997.
Yeah.
And so...
Did they kill the surgeon or something like that?
Well, yeah, it was gruesome what happened to the surgeons. They ended up in 55-gallon drum barrels, cement, the whole nine. And so when Amado Carrillo passed away, everyone expected Esparragoza to take over. But the brother said, no, I'm going to be in charge. And, the thing about Mexico is power doesn't come from weapons or product. Power comes from who has access to the politicians. And so Amado Carrillo was spending $500 million a year in bribes. Esparragoza was handling much of the drug operation. Carrillo was handling the bribes and the political protection. Well, his brother was involved in that operation. So his brother's the one who's paying the governor, paying the chief of police, paying the senator. And so after Carrillo passes away, the brother's like, hey, look, I'm the one who's going to provide the cover. They're not going to deal with you. They're dealing with me. And so Esparragoza takes a step back, lets the brother take over. Everybody else knows it should have been him.
Right.
People don't respect men who inherit positions without having earned them.
Right.
And that was a classic situation where he essentially got passed over.
I was going to say, nobody looks at a lottery winner and think.
An astute businessman.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, you really knew how to pick those random numbers.
Yeah, and so and so it created, a certain level of animosity. And now they needed each other while they were facing this onslaught from the two groups. But now that things had kind of stabilized, Guzman, Arturo Beltran, and Esparragoza get together and said, you know what? Let's take this other guy out.
Right.
And so Guzman essentially double crosses the heads of the Juarez cartel that they had previously entered into an alliance with. Now they don't get Vicente Carrillo, but they get his brother Rodolfo. So now this launches another war.
How do they get him? What do you mean?
They caught him.
Was he shopping? Was he the one that was shopping with his wife or something?
Right.
Yeah.
Coming out of a store.
Yeah.
And, high-end shopping mall.
In a mall, just shootout. Just gun him down.
In the parking lot, yeah.
Not like with a 22 to the back of the head. Not like a nice, sweet, boop. No. Like full on, right? Wasn't it like full on?
Like machine guns.
Machine guns and stuff. Like these guys they're not surgeons. It's not surgical skill taking out a guy. Anyway, sorry.
And so that initially kicks off what went on to become the bloodiest battle. I mean, within just a few years, Juarez was the murder capital of the world.
Right.
And so they've still got, they're still in war with two other groups. Now they just kicked off one with this third group. Like it was unnecessary to do that. It was Hitler invading Russia.
Right. Just stupidity.
Just pure sheer stupidity.
Yeah.
And that's where the
I'm gonna say arrogance.
Hubris and arrogance. And so, but they were able to, because of the increase in revenue that they were getting in, they were able to actually finance this. And so for the next 5 years, that's where you get this golden era where, when we think of the Sinaloa cartel, you're thinking 04, 05, 06. That was their peak. And everything remained fine up until 2008. Now, in 2008, Alfredo Beltr&aacute gets arrested by the authorities. And by this point, the other leaders of the core nucleus, they knew that Chapo was manipulating the Americans.
Okay.
And so
they're not happy about that.
Well, they're blaming him.
Yeah.
Because he double crossed, they're all for him double crossing
the other guy.
The Carrillo.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden it's like, well, now the head of this group gets taken out. Like, hold on a second. How do you get, it's him.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that kicks off now a struggle between the two. So Arturo, the number 2, who was good friends with the guy you were talking about from prison, that was his best friend.
Right.
Okay. So Arturo decides, hey, you know what? He's going to retaliate. He kills Chapo Guzman's son. So now now you're kicking off massive personal vendettas.
Right.
The kind that are never going to get resolved.
Yeah.
Someone's going to end up deceased because there was no negotiated settlement.
Right.
And so the Beltr&aacute faction breaks away from Core Sinaloa. Then a year later, Nacho Coronell gets knocked off. He gets killed after the authorities went to arrest him.
Mm-hmm.
And so naturally, Coronell's group are like, hey, hold on a second, this is Guzman again. Now, in reality, like Guzman didn't have anything to do with Alfredo Beltr&aacute getting busted.
Okay.
The authorities just apprehended him. Arturo launches war against Guzman. Guzman gets Arturo busted.
Right.
The lawyer, Humberto Loya, at that point, hands off responsibility to Vicente Zambada.
Who was the one that was in the out in the ocean? He was like fishing or something like
No,
that.
that's another one of the Arianos. They catch him later on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but so this is the same circumstance where the lawyer, he's like, hey, look, I've been running back and forth between these guys for 5 or 6 years. I'm through with my cooperation.
Yeah.
Like I've worked off whatever I have to do. I'm going to transfer responsibility to Zambada's kid.
Right. And they agree. They basically want.
Well, yeah, the Americans are like, yeah, no problem. So the Zambada's kid's got indictments. They want him for hundreds of tons.
Right.
You got DEA agents meeting with the guy.
So the lawyer, the DEA, like or the U.S. Attorney's Office, the indictments, the warrant, everything for the lawyer, they say quashed it. You're good. You're clean. You go about your business. Just because he's been running the errands back of giving him all these different guys. Like you just busted fucking 50 or 100, 200, 1,000 guys in the last 5 years.
And not only the number of the guy, but the quality. You took out the head of the Gulf cartel. You took out the head of the Tijuana cartel. Like this is the kind of cooperation that normally the government would give you the keys to the kingdom for.
Right. So they quash any problems that he has. He's free and clear now.
So now they decide, okay, well, someone has to take over being the contact man.
Right. Which ends up being
Zambada's son. So at this point,
he's got a lot of sons.
At this point, later on, the government was like, oh, no, we were just hearing what they had to say, but they weren't getting anything in return. Like,
it was all bullshit. It's bullshit.
Later on, when Zambada was going to trial, he brought his motions pre-trial because he's claiming, hey, I had immunity. I'm working for the government the whole time.
Yeah.
Like, I'm meeting with you people.
Yeah. And just before all that comes out, they fucking make a deal.
Well, no, not just that. They asked to get permission to bring the lawyer, Humberto Loya.
Oh, that's right.
And the government imposes national security privilege, saying, no, you can't call the lawyer. Because the lawyer's going to come in and say, hey, look, yeah, you guys knew what we were doing the whole time.
Right. Now that's going to make the U.S. government look really bad.
Yeah. So then they end up cutting a deal with Zambada's kid. He ends up getting like 14 years.
Right. Where he should have gotten
I get 40 years for being a fraction of the size of Zambada, but they essentially just give him a get out of jail free card.
He also gave him like $1 billion or something too, didn't he?
He promised to do so.
Okay.
They haven't collected.
I'm going to cut you a check too.
They haven't collected yet.
Okay.
And so, so Zambada's kid steps in to take over responsibility. And so the information is still coming directly from Core Sinaloa. Well, they end up getting Alfredo Beltr&aacute knocked off. Well, it's just 5-6 months later that Nacho Coronell gets taken out. And so if you look at it from an outside, like from an insider perspective, who benefits? Guzman.
Right.
From an outsider perspective, like it's impossible that all these big guys are getting taken off in such a short order because suddenly the Mexican government became competent.
Right.
Because each of these guys are also paying for political protection.
Right.
So who's powerful enough to overcome their local protection?
Yeah.
It's got to be coming from the Americans.
The Americans.
And so that ends up triggering the destabilization of core Sinaloa. Because up until that point, they'd had that 5 or 6 year run that was just on fire.
Right.
With the death of Nacho Coronell, this is what ultimately gave rise to the group that became known as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel.
So we're gonna stop it now because we're gonna do another video talking about the history of the new generation up until present cartel activity. Right?
Sure.
Okay.
No
So
problem.
we'll do that. Also, if you like the video, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you get notified of videos just like this. And please share the video. Please leave a comment. Try and respond to as many comments as possible. Also, please consider joining my Patreon. We're going to have specific Patreon content on Patreon. Pete and I are about to have a completely different discussion about, well, not a completely different. We're going to have a discussion a little bit more on the cartel and a couple of special events. We're going to take that stuff and we're going to put that on Patreon. Please consider joining the Patreon. $10 a month. It's great content. I appreciate it. Thank you. See ya.